Hello and welcome to this special edition of The Heat. As part of the new reality broadcasting during the pandemic, I'm coming to you from my living room just outside Washington, D.C. via Zoom. Later in the show, we'll be talking about the medical aspects of COVID-19. But first, I'm joined by Martin Jacques, global affairs commentator, author, and academic, and also author of the book, When China Rules the World. He joins us from London via Zoom. Martin, great to have you with us.
Pleasure to see you again.
You know, 3 years ago, we talked about your book, When China Rules the World. Now we are living through this catastrophic pandemic. You have written a lot about our changing world. You've made it a study of yours. What is your overall reaction to what is going on right now?
Well, it's obviously a quite extraordinary moment, in which we're all living through an entirely different kind of set of events. In our lives, and every country in some degree or other, some very acutely, some not so acutely, are being turned upside down by the situation. And I think one of the things that it underlines is that those tendencies, those trends which we've been witnessing, especially in the more recent past, have been greatly accentuated by the event. So, for example, the difficulties in the relationship between the United States and China, the growing tensions, have been amplified by this crisis. The fact that we know the capacity of different states and the attitudes of peoples in different states are very different. And this has been reflected in a very acute form in the way that different countries have handled the pandemic. So I think that it's a very, I suppose from a kind of anthropological point of view, it's quite interesting.
You're right, actually. Different countries have handled this coronavirus in very different ways. But let's look at the Chinese response. How much did China benefit in responding to this crisis through its political system, its unique political system?
I think that that China benefited. I mean, I think China's, it's got to be said, was somewhat slow off the mark and made some serious mistakes. But in a way, I think the fact that China was the guinea pig, in other words, China faced the problem first and everyone else could benefit from it, has got to be taken strongly into account. And when China got a real handle on the situation, understood the threat, then it moved with remarkable speed and effectiveness. And I think that was it was a great achievement, actually, I think, for the Chinese government, the way it handled it. And if you look at it, the per capita figures compared with other countries, then China's undoubtedly had the best performance in terms of deaths per capita.
You know, here in the United States, there have been commentators and analysts who've been very critical in the way in which the United States has handled this pandemic. We look at what's going on. We see that the country was unprepared for what took place. There's a lot of tension between the White House and the media, the White House and governors around the states. I mean, do you think this criticism is fair? Is it justified?
Well, yeah, unfortunately, I think it is. I mean, America just was totally unprepared for it. And Trump's attitude, was to dismiss it, to regard it, to quote him, as a hoax. And so, I mean, he was just interested in the presidential election. There was no preparation at all. And I think the reason for this is that because he really didn't believe that it could happen in the United States, that this was a sort of China problem, if you like. And the result has been a disaster from a governance point of view in the United States.
There's been a lot of China bashing going on here in the United States. We heard it initially from the president, referring to this as a China virus. Then we heard it from some of his top cabinet members talking about a China virus. We're seeing this China bashing actually across party lines. We're hearing it from Republicans, from Democrats as well. How does China counter this?
Well, let me say first, I'm not really surprised by this reaction in the United States. and to some extent, it has echoes in Europe, not least in my own country, the UK. What's that all about? Well, I think what it's about is probably the most important thing is that, the Western countries, especially the United States, have done very badly in response to the pandemic. And China has done, relatively speaking, very well. And so the situation, look, the death count in America is a deep embarrassment. So in a way, what I think is involved here is an act of distraction and deflection, which is to put the focus on China and try and find ways of blaming China to reduce the negativity of America's own reaction to the pandemic.
As you say, a distraction and a deflection, but are there any longer term consequences for the China-US relationship from what we're hearing right now?
Well, I think what it underlines is that the growing acrimony between China and the United States, which is essentially a function of a shift in the American attitude rather than anything that China's done, has been reinforced and amplified by the pandemic. And I think that what this suggests to me is that this relationship, this trend is going to continue and could well worsen. I mean, there are elements of the attack in the States on China in relationship to this, which and the call for an international investigation, some people calling ridiculously for reparations and so on. This is getting a bit extraordinary, and I think that's worrying. In fact, I think it's in its extremity, it's disturbing.
Do you think this could lead to more direct competition between China and the United States? There was a piece in The Guardian by its diplomatic editor, and the diplomatic editor put it this way: the discussion in global think tanks rages not about cooperation, but whether the Chinese or the US will emerge as leaders of the post-coronavirus world. How much will this crisis change the world, do you think, or will it remain the same?
Well, I think it's still early days to say. I mean, I think first of all, at the governance level, China emerges much more strongly out of this situation than the United States. China has done very well. The United States has made a complete mess of it. So therefore, the competition between them in a global context has moved into a new area, which we haven't had explicitly before. We've had it implicitly, but not explicitly. Namely, how competent is the governance of each country? Now, the implicit nature of it in the past has been to do with economic competence, but we've not really had it in a broader political form like this. And I think that in this context, China's position is going to be significantly enhanced. It'll vary around the world, but I mean, I noticed, for example, some opinion poll in the Observer yesterday in the UK, which that more people, that a greater number of people in Britain thought that China had handled the crisis better, the pandemic crisis, better than the UK. So, I mean, and Britain is not, pro-China. And I think that's quite interesting. Italy, I think the same pattern and so on. So I think that is certainly going to be a factor. In broader terms, a lot depends on what happens economically, I think, as well. And it's still too early to be very sure what China's recovery is going to be like. It looks as if it's coming early out of it, but how will its growth look this year, the rest of this year and next year? Unknown quantity. Likewise, the United States. I think that it's difficult. I wouldn't be apocalyptic about the consequences. I don't think we're going to see absolutely dramatic changes, but we can't absolutely rule that out.
What about the future of things like globalization? We know that China has been a champion of globalization. It's got some major projects around the world, like the Belt and Road Initiative. What happens to them?
Well, I think that the Belt and Road is a real a strength for China and a strength for the countries who are part of Belt and Road, because it's clear that its growth has been quite a major success. And this provides China with a relationship with a large number of countries around the world, especially, of course, developing countries. So I think that is a positive. And I expect, in the light of this crisis, those relationships to be reinforced and enhanced, though a lot depends on exactly how China and others emerge economically from the situation. So we could expect globalization in a regional form, that regional form, to be reinforced and to expand. Question is then, key question is, what's going to happen to globalization in an overarching global sense rather than a regional sense? For example, crucially, the relationship between the United States and China. You know, I think that this is going to continue to be a major point of tension and conflict. I think that America's direction is and will continue to be America first. Therefore, attempts to find ways of reducing the relationship between the two countries and so on. How that will play out in Europe. I mean, Europe is definitely, there's clear blue water between Europe in many ways now and the United States, but how far is that going to go? For example, will Britain continue to welcome Huawei in a limited way into the 5G network and so on, and likewise in other countries in Europe where the same process has been taking place? I think that probably will continue, but we can't rule out in this situation that there isn't, the sheer venom of the criticism of China, that we are witnessing a slow deterioration to the point where we can begin to talk about a new Cold War. We can see those elements definitely taking shape. I mean, I heard an interview the other day here in the UK with the deputy ambassador the Chinese ambassador on the BBC, and it was one of the most disgusting interviews I've heard since the Cold War. I mean, it was just like a show trial, an international show trial. I mean, the interview was incredibly bullying and so on. So, I mean, and I just took that as a kind of straw in the wind, that this has got, this is there's the possibility of a further deterioration in the relationship.
You know, we've seen a growing Chinese presence around the world over the past few decades. Chinese students study at universities in many, many countries all over the world. We see Chinese tourists, a growing number of Chinese tourists in all parts of the world. Do you think that's going to change?
Well, I do, yes. I mean, from what I see of the figures and the projections, a lot of Chinese students who went to Western countries, notably, I mean, the three key countries in this context, I think, are the US, the UK, I think the UK is bigger now, UK, US, and Australia, and all of them are expecting a drop in the numbers of Chinese students. And I think there are at least two reasons why this will happen. First, because the fact that the pandemic is so serious, so acute in these countries. I mean, who wants to go to America if you're a young person in this situation, or indeed to a lesser extent, but still important, the UK. Australia is in a different position. And the other problem, I think, is that, Chinese students are being made less welcome now. I mean, I was talking to a Chinese student this morning, and, he was giving me examples of the kind of racism, out-and-out racism that he's met in the street. People cars driving by and the driver shouting some abuse just because he looked Chinese. He was Chinese, but and so I think that the numbers of international students at UK universities and US universities is going to decline quite a bit, and especially Chinese students. How long that will go on for, I don't know. It could be quite a long-term trend. It could be relatively permanent trend, or it may turn out to be relatively short-term.
Martin, getting back to the US response to this, what is your view of the criticism we've heard from the White House of the World Health Organization, also its announcement that it's going to be suspending funding to the organization?
Well, I think it's the most absurd move in a situation of a global pandemic to withdraw money from the one global institution that handles the question of health. I mean, this is utterly irresponsible. You know, a global pandemic requires global cooperation. And for the United States to withdraw from it is utterly irresponsible, in my view. Of the criticism of the organization, I mean, I think the organization has done a very good job over a long period of time. Sure, it could do more, but to do more, it needs a lot more funding, which is exactly what happens because the world is still ill-equipped to handle a pandemic. And one thing we've absolutely seen from this crisis is how it affects everyone, and it moves from country to country with rapid speed. And in that situation, countries need to be cooperating in all sorts of ways, above all, in the first instance, scientifically, to be able to handle it. So this is moving in exactly the opposite direction to the way any country should be shifting, let alone the most powerful country in the world.
That's right. As you say, you know, countries should be cooperating, but we are seeing the rise of nationalism right now as countries look to protect their own interests.
Well, we are. I mean, one of the most disappointing things in this context is Europe, you know, where Italy was very hard hit, followed by Spain. And it was a situation which required European cooperation. And we ended up in a situation where China was giving more help, medical aid to Italy than any other country in the world, including the other EU countries. So to some extent, you know, there's no question that countries have been having to fight it, broadly speaking, on their own. But of course, they've also learned from each other. I mean, we mustn't ignore this fact. I mean, you know, the strategy of testing and isolating and tracing and so on, you know, which the British have never done before, but it's part of the debate. It's part of the argument. And the British have been extremely slow in relation to everything. But one way or another, a country which in many ways tends to think it's exceptional is being forced to recognize that it can learn a great deal from others who've done things much better.
One other point, how will this pandemic affect global migration patterns, do you think? And I'm thinking especially of migration from the south to the north.
Well, we don't yet know how the pandemic is going to impact on the developing world. It's still not entirely clear. I mean, some countries are hugely affected, Brazil, but Brazil not least because of the sheer incompetence of the president. Will that happen what's going to happen in sub-Saharan Africa? You know, this is obviously a very, very big question, a very important question. If the effects are drastic, then definitely it will increase the migration or the desire to migrate from their countries to Europe. If it doesn't happen, if it happens so much, if it's not so severe, then we won't see that effect. But I would imagine it will increase the desire, and then countries will clamp down on it.
Martin, we are going to have to leave it there. Always great getting your insights. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks a lot, Anand. Thank you.
Please stay with us on The Heat.
CGTN, covering coronavirus. From Asia, Africa, Europe, and America. The dangers, the uncertainty, a global effort to stop the spread and save lives. For the latest updates on coronavirus, stay with CGTN. See the difference.
Hello, I'm Anand, Naidoo, and thanks for joining us. As we adjust to the new realities of broadcasting during the pandemic, I am bringing you this show from my home just outside Washington, D.C. The number of coronavirus infections has been rising and the number of deaths have been surging. With that in mind, we now talk about the medical aspects of COVID-19. I'm joined by Assistant Professor Chen. He joins us from New Haven, Connecticut. He is an assistant professor in public health at Yale University. Professor, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start right here in the United States, where the death toll has now gone way past 50,000. Are you surprised at that number?
Yeah, so far, according to all kinds of forecasts, I'm not surprised given that the policies we are adopting. So this number could be getting even worse if we are not maintaining stringent public health measures.
You know, the reason I ask if you're surprised, because this country has enormous resources and medical expertise. One wouldn't expect numbers that high, but we are seeing those numbers.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, this is something from that perspective is very surprising. But if we look at the time window when the U.S. health authorities was responding to this pandemic, so we really delayed for quite a month or 2 months. So that was the golden time period when we could take early actions to flatten the curve, which may avoid much of this deaths.
So is it your view, Professor, that if we had not delayed so long, that the death toll could have been much lower?
Yes, exactly. We could get healthcare systems more prepared, for example, the PPEs, medical supplies, and also we can better protect the older persons, especially those who are living in institutions like nursing homes. So I think many of the states have high number of mortality due to the infections in the nursing homes. This is the case in America and also across Europe.
You know, despite these high numbers that we see in the United States, there are some parts of the country which are starting to reopen. The state of Georgia, for instance, opened some business sectors on Friday. Others will open on Monday. Movies will open on Monday, for instance. Is this a little too early and a little too risky?
Yeah, I fully agree with your assessment. Yeah, this is very much early. And I don't think any states is now ready to reopen because one most important indicator is about the testing and the testing capacity. So far, in the last couple of days, things get better. So we are able to test around like 300,000 per day, which is a large increase from previous days. But still, this is far less than enough. Some estimates, most optimistic estimate shows that we need to have around like 500,000 tests per day, which means every week we can test around the 3.5 million US population, which is 1%. So that's the minimum we need to be safely and more confidently reopen the economy. But so far, no states are reaching that level. And overall, we are still far short of this number. And I think another thing is, even if we choose to reopen, we need to prioritize those really essential industries. And those industries are most critical to the whole economy. But if we look at Georgia, so they are looking and they reopen the sector which account for a tiny percentage of their economy and also is non-essential. So I don't think it's a good way to have this reopen, and it's not a good way to choose to reopen this sector versus that sector. There has to be some plan, and I hope this plan should be at the national level, have a coordination plan instead of every state act on their own.
Getting back to your earlier point about testing, we're hearing a lot about testing and tracing. If we look at China, China's done an excellent job. Even a small country like New Zealand has managed to crush the coronavirus. What steps do the United States need to take right now?
That's a critical question. I think at the national level, there should be a national strategy, for example, by the health authorities, the FEMA, should be better coordinating the efforts at the states to mobilize the medical resources for the doctors, for the facilities. But so far, we think if we look at every state is now acting on their own. So they are even competing for those medical resources, which is without much coordination at the national level. So I think so far the most critically needed action is at the national level to coordinate their efforts, because without coordination, the competition will not be able to efficiently drive the better allocation of these resources. And eventually, all 50 states had to be gone out of this pandemic altogether. We cannot leave any state behind. Given the large mobility in America, people are traveling back and forth from East Coast to West Coast. If we have one state in pandemic, then the American won't be recovering. So this should be a coordinated plan.
Yeah, right now we're seeing a very patchwork response to the coronavirus. One other thing, we're learning a lot more about COVID-19. I mean, we're seeing some very alarming developments, like people in their 30s and 40s having strokes. What is it about this disease that most concerns you?
So I think this is a disease really confounded with other fundamental illness, like the chronic conditions, obesity rate. So if we look at the mortality portfolio, people with some underlying conditions are more vulnerable to death. So that's why we see more deaths out of proportionally affecting the ethnic minorities and people in the lower socioeconomic status and the people in less flexible jobs. So there's a huge health disparity with regard to the fatality of this virus.
Professor, what is your assessment of the situation in China right now?
So I think so far the situation in China is getting more and more promising. So most of in the epicenter Hubei province, more severe diseases already recovered. So they are having even 0 new cases about those chronic ill conditions. So you see the central government delegation is heading back from the epicenter to Beijing yesterday. I think in China, they worry more about the imported cases, especially from northern neighbor like Russia. So the imported cases sometimes is more straightforward to deal with, because with contact tracing, with isolation, with testing. So, and given the large experience the medical workers and the health facilities, health authorities are getting from treating patients in the previous epicenter, Wuhan. So I think those knowledge will be very helpful for the clinic experience, clinical treating of those patients eventually. But I think given this so far the spreading of the cases near the border and in some southern states, some southern provinces, this may become a pattern. So occasionally we may find some small scale outbreak in certain part of China. But this need to be done at the national level to have a strategic plan. Once we have maintained the test capacity, then we are able to make real-time data based policy to address the local issue.
Assistant Professor Chen, thanks so much for joining me on this special edition of The Heat.
My pleasure. Thank you.
I'm Anand, Naidoo, broadcasting this special edition from my home just outside Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.
CGTN, covering coronavirus. From Asia, Africa, Europe, and America. The dangers, the uncertainty, a global effort to stop the spread and save lives. For the latest updates on coronavirus, stay with CGTN. See the difference.